Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Wisco Whiskey Review. My name's Jeff, and today in this video I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a crash course when it comes to bourbon. Now, a lot of my reviews coming up will probably be bourbon, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a background information about what it is, what it isn't. That way you guys can have some information there. All right, to start off with, bourbon is an American whiskey. It's a classification or a certain type of American whiskey. Now, the mash bill has to be at least 51% corn, and then any number of percentages of grains after that. The most common ones being rye, wheat, and malted barley. Now, it can have buckwheat, it can have amaranth, quinoa, any other types of grains in it, but you typically see rye, wheat, and malted barley as the other grains in the mash bill. Now, it can be distilled at no higher than 159 proof, which is 79.5% ABV. It has to enter the barrel at no higher than 125 proof, and it has to be bottled at no less than 80 proof, which is 40% ABV. Now, if you see straight on a label, it means it has to be aged at least 2 years, and it can't have any caramel colorings or flavorings added. The only thing you can add to that is water. And if it's less than 4 years old, it has to have an age statement on the label to tell you how old that is. Now, as far as age statements on bottles, anytime you see an age statement, say it says 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, that has to be the youngest whiskey in that batch or in that bottle. So that means it could have, if you see a 6-year age statement, it could have 6-year, 10-year, and 12-year whiskey in it. If you see a 4 years, it could have 4, 5, and 6-year whiskeys. So let's talk about what bourbon doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky like most people think. It doesn't have to be aged in white oak barrels or American oak barrels. So they could be French oak, they could be any other type of oak as long as they're charred new oak barrels. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is Tennessee whiskey. All right, Tennessee whiskey is essentially a bourbon, but before they put the unaged distillate into the charred new oak barrels, they run it through a series of maple charcoal. Now, this helps remove some of the impurities. It kind of mellows out the distillate and gives it a little bit more of a corn-forward flavor. Now, that's really the only difference between a Tennessee whiskey and bourbon. Some common brands of Tennessee whiskey would be Jack Daniel's, George Dickel, and I believe there are a few others, but those are the two main ones that you see on the shelves. So now we'll talk about batching. Now, batching is essentially just a distillery blending barrels of whiskey together. Now, they don't call it blended whiskey because sometimes that confuses people, since there is an American blended whiskey category out there. Now, that is just straight bourbon whiskey that's blended with grain neutral spirit, usually clear. It tends to be a little bit cheaper. There aren't too many of those around though on the shelves, so usually you see straight bourbon or flavored bourbon at this point. So the batching, again, is blending of barrels from one distillery. Now, it can be anywhere from 2 barrels all the way up to thousands of barrels. Anytime you see small batch, there's no legal definition of what a small batch is. Again, it could be anywhere from 2 to 1,000 depending on the distillery. A lot of them try to keep it within the 100 to 500 barrel range, sometimes a little less, depending on the size of the distillery. But small batch is just that, it's anything that the distillery wants to make it. As far as single barrel goes, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's bourbon in a bottle from one specific barrel that the distillery picked out. A lot of store picks are single barrel, so if you go to, say, a grocery store or a liquor store, they might have their own specific bottling of one specific barrel from the distillery. Sometimes you see blends that are store picks, but most of the time it's single barrel. And lastly, any flavoring that's added to whiskey, it can be called a bourbon, but it's not a straight bourbon, and it has to be labeled with the flavoring added on the label. So you'll see straight bourbon with blank flavoring added, whether it's maple, honey, apple, anything like that. And it can range anywhere. I've seen 30%, which is more of a liqueur, up to 45% ABV, and that's still going to be a flavored whiskey. So the next thing I'll talk about is the bottled in bond. Now, if you see that category, that's going to be a specific bottling, and it has to abide by certain rules. Now, this is aged in a government bonded warehouse. It has to be at least 4 years old and it has to be bottled at least 100 proof or 50%. It can have no additives other than pure water. It must include the distillery on the bottle. Sometimes whiskey will be distilled at one distillery location under a certain name, and then it'll be bottled under a different company. So if you see a bottled and bond one, it has to include the original distillery somewhere on the label. Usually it's on the back, and then it'll have the bottler name as well. And lastly, a bottled and bond whiskey has to be distilled by one distillery from one master distiller in one season of a distillery. All right, as far as the barrels go, the new distillate is poured into new charred oak barrels, and there's a range of charring that goes on. It can be anywhere from 1 to 4. I have heard that there is a 5th level of charring, but it's kind of dangerous to do that because at that point, the inside of the barrel is so unstable that it could almost be porous and allow some of the bourbon to leak out. Now, some of that happens a little bit automatically as the wood breathes or the barrel breathes. But if you char it to 5, it can the barrel can start falling apart a little bit, and you'll lose a lot of the whiskey inside, and that's kind of dangerous to do that. So usually you see between a 1 level char to a 4 level char, 1 being the lowest, 4 being the most charred. There's also a thing called toasting, which is just taking really hot air, maybe a few flames, and kind of toasting the inside of the barrel instead of actually burning it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how bourbon is made. So again, you start with a mash bill, and that's going to be 51% corn for bourbon, and then any kind of other percentages of grain involved. And then they grind that up into a mash or a flour. Now they add water to that, and there has to be enzymes to eat the sugar from the mash to convert that into alcohol. Those enzymes just come out easier for malted barley than a lot of other grains. So usually you'll see at least 10%, 5% malted barley just to kind of get that fermentation process going. So you take the mash, you put it in water, and you cook that mash to kind of heat it up and cook that all together. Now, once that's done, they take that and drain it, and that water is called the wort. Now that goes into a tank, and then what they do is they add yeast to that. So then the yeast starts eating those sugars, the enzymes, breaking down those sugars and turning it into alcohol and CO2. So after the fermentation, at that stage, this is going to be called distiller's beer. Now that is taken and distilled in a still. Now there are different types of stills involved. There are pot stills, which has to be done batch by batch. There are continuous stills or column stills, which those are pretty common, and those are used to continuously make alcohol. It involves plates with holes in it, and as the condensation rises, it hits those cold plates and condenses. The main thing for distilling is you want to keep the temperature above the boiling point of alcohol or ethanol, which is I believe 174, and you want to keep it under the boiling point of water, which is 212 Fahrenheit. Now this allows the alcohol to evaporate, but keeps the water kind of from evaporating too much. So you'll have that alcohol vapor rising in the column still or the pot still and condensing either on plates or in the copper tubing. Now that's usually distilled 2 times, sometimes more. The more times you distill something, the more flavors you pull out of it, but you want to get it to that nice medium. So once the alcohol is distilled, that's going to be called distillate or new make. That's going to be a clear liquid, and it's going to taste a lot more corn than anything else. Now it's this new distillate that they put into the charred oak barrels, and that's what gives it its color. Again, with straight bourbon whiskey, you cannot add any coloring, can't add any flavors. It's just going to be coloring from the inside of that charred oak barrel. And the longer you let it sit in the barrel, the more coloring it usually gets. Other things can affect that too, like the temperature, the heat, the seasons, things like that. Even the type of warehouse it is. And some warehouses, or rick houses as they're called, where all the barrels are stored, some of those are going to be brick, some are going to be metal, some are wood. So it all depends on just a lot of different factors there. So lastly, we're just going to talk about common things that you'll smell in bourbon and common things that you'll taste in bourbon. Now when it comes to the nose in bourbons, a lot of common things you're going to pick up are vanilla, caramel, baking spices, honey, oak, different floral and fruits. Sometimes a little bit of citrus depending on the rye content. There will also be some brown sugar, molasses. Now as far as the palate goes, you usually get a lot of the same things that you do with the nose. Sometimes there'll be some differences, but again, the main things coming off are going to be vanilla, caramel, oak, brown sugar, honey, molasses, things like that. Now a lot of those flavors, again, since there aren't any artificial flavors added, they're going to be coming more so from the barrel than anything else. Some of it does come from the grains used, but a lot of the oak, obviously, the caramel and vanilla and things like that are coming from the barrel. Now that's due to different chemicals that get changed during the charring process, and that's what makes charring a barrel so important to bourbon. Because once the inside of a barrel gets burned, that wood gets converted to some sugar compounds and some other things in the wood, and all of those chemicals influence the distillate that's put in there. So anytime you get caramel, vanilla, honey, any kind of floral things or peanut flavors, those are all coming from the barrel mostly. Anything else is also going to be coming from the grain. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two, but with enough practice you can usually pick out between them. Alright, so now I'm just going to go over kind of some examples of what I've been talking about here. Now on this side we've got some Wild Turkey 101. Now this is a high rye mash bill bourbon. So again, it's at least 51% corn, but it has a little bit higher rye content than some other bourbons are. Now I believe it's about 30 to 35% in Wild Turkey 101 as far as the rye goes. The rye is going to give it a little bit more of a spice kick, a little bit more baking spices. All right, the next one's going to be the Evan Williams Bottled in Bond. Now this is a good example of that category that I talked about earlier, where it's aged at least 4 years in a government bonded warehouse by one distillery, one season, all of that stuff. Now this one here, this is going to be a good example of a wheated bourbon. This is Maker's Mark, and there are some other brands as well, like Larceny, Pappy Van Winkle, Weller, things like that. Those are going to have some wheat in the mash bill, whereas a lot of bourbons don't. Now this kind of adds a sweetness to the profile, a little less spiciness like the rye. On this side we've got, this is going to be an example of a flavored bourbon. Now this is Knob Creek Maple. This is one of the higher alcohol percentage ones that I've seen in a flavored whiskey so far. Like I said, a lot of them are kind of between that 30 to 35 range, but this one's 45%. Now again, even on the label it says Kentucky Straight Bourbon with natural flavors. So again stated, it's got to state that it has flavorings added. It can't be just called a straight bourbon. Alright guys, well that's going to be about it. I hope you learned something, and I hope you can take this knowledge and apply it to trying different bourbons. There are tons of different options out there, ranging anything from 10, 15 bucks all the way up to hundreds of dollars or even more for certain bottles. So I would find a profile you like, try some different brands. Each brand kind of has their own flavor. Again, some have a little bit more rye in it, some have a little bit more wheat, some are aged longer. There's just a lot of different varieties when it comes to bourbon. So again, I hope you learned something and I hope you had fun. If you liked the video, hit like, subscribe to the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a good day. All right, cheers.